Welcome back to pregame.tv. Friday NCAA Tournament action. We've got Kansas State versus Kentucky. Guys, we take a look at this one, and, I like to listen to all the, as we like to say, the talking heads. And sorry, you've got a radio show, so you're a talking head too. But you hear all the different shows, and everybody's got their opinion. This team's overrated. This one got snubbed. This one should have been a higher seed, this and that. If this is the now team. And all of a sudden, I'm starting to hear a lot of love again for Kentucky, because they woke up and they made the run to the SEC championship game, and then they only lost by 1 to Florida. They're back. They're back. Were they ever here? This is a team I know that opened the season is the preseason number one. How could they have been the preseason number one team coming into this year? The way they didn't even make the NCAA tournament last year, and they got beat in the NIT by my hometown team, Robert Morris. Most people don't even know where Robert Morris is. That's a Pittsburgh school. That was a huge game for the NIT for them.
Robert Morris found their niche in the NIT, pounding St. John's again last night, a 1 seed.
They did, and it was a big deal having Calipari come back because where the university is, Calipari actually was from and stuff. The university's so small, and where it's at out by the old airport in Pittsburgh, it was like a zoo for that game last year. But how could you be so high on this team? It's just they're always a marquee team, and I think you're always paying a premium when you look at a team like Kentucky.
Yeah, I'll just say this is a new starting five, and they thought this was the best starting five ever as far as, of all these freshmen coming in. I will say this, Julius Randle's the real deal. There is no doubt. Next to McDermott, he's probably the second best. And Jabari Parker, so those guys right there, the top 3 players in college basketball. But, the Harrison twins, it's all about whether or not they play with tenacity and play together, because they both need to play well for Kentucky to win. And they were playing lousy basketball at the end of the regular season, but they win 2 games in the SEC tournament where they probably played their 2 best back-to-back games in about a month and a half against Georgia and LSU. And LSU in the second half, they dominated. And then they did make the comeback against Florida. But Florida will let you back in the game because they do slow it down.
Now, Bryan, we talk a lot about there's myths about beating a team for the 3rd time in a season. And that matchup against Florida on Sunday in the SEC championship game was the 3rd meeting. Going in, win, lose, or draw, Florida was going to be a number 1 seed. They were playing with house money, nothing to lose, nothing to gain by, blowing out Kentucky. And to me, watching that game, to me, it was like they were toying with them. It's like Kentucky was just like a fly at a picnic that they just kept, swatting away. And, it ended up being the tight game at the end. Kentucky, closed it at the end. But I really never thought Florida was going to lose that game. What were your thoughts watching the game?
No, you touched on this in the last video about all the turnover in college basketball now. And in Kentucky, right there, every year they bring in the best freshmen the last year, and they're gone. And that's the same problem they've had all season long. It takes a long time to get to start playing with each other. So a lot of people, and I could see the love for Kentucky now, that they get all these talented players who've had a whole season together. Now they've got a point where they've got something to play for. So a lot of people are on Kentucky. But you just can't turn on a switch and all of a sudden you're playing bad basketball, you're playing good basketball. Now, I'm looking to go against Kentucky, but I just don't like the matchup here against Kansas State team, whose all their best wins have been at home. And that's my concern here. These are really 2 teams I want to go against. But I think we'll have, if Kentucky does advance here, we'll have the ability in the next game to be able to go against them because, as you said, all the talking heads have been talking about this Kentucky team could go all the way.
I will say, too, that a lot of people say Calipari, the best recruiter, not the best X's and O's guy. I don't understand the last play against Florida. How do you have Harrison give it off to Young when you have Randle down low? All you need is 1 point to tie 2 to win. Get it to the big fella. If he gets doubled, he's going to get fouled. He's that good. Instead, you have Young coming around a screen on a little handoff from Harrison. He slips and whatever, but that's not the play. Young is a sharpshooter from the outside, set his feet, and he's going to score. That was a lousy play to be drawn up for the end of the game.
And when you talked about all the kids coming in and then, now they're playing well, I think a lot of people were trying to make the comparison, and it's not the same. If you remember Calipari's, I believe it was the last year at Memphis when they had all of the recruit committee, they started that season slow. But then they continue to build. Like we talk about, you got to get that chemistry.
That was the best team in basketball. They blew that game against Kansas. That's the biggest don't get me started. I had a future on them from the beginning of the season.
I had Memphis big in that game, so yeah, I remember the game too. Isn't it amazing how you always remember the bad ones? But the difference in that one is that team had a head of steam rolling in down the end of the season. This Kentucky team's doesn't have a head of steam to me coming in here. And
we talked all season long that the SEC has been down this year. So just to be able to go and beat teams that maybe they should have beaten, and then going against a team that, as you pointed out, may have been really looking past them. I don't buy into it. Kentucky, I think, is a little bit overrated, in my opinion.
Kansas State, on the other hand, they dropped their last 3. Okay, now they did lose to Iowa State, and that was a great game. 91-85 was the final, but that game could have gone either way. If they win that game, Iowa State doesn't end up winning the Big 12. Iowa State's probably a 4 or 5 seed. You know, I mean,
that game was right down to the wire. That's a very misleading final score. If you had Kansas State, that's one of those. I know customers don't like to hear it, but it was a right side.
Well, K-State also showed they can play that style. They're usually better off with the game in the 60s. Here's a game in the high 80s, low 90s, and they're right there. But they've got players: Bradling, Southwell, Foster, Wandu, and Gibson. Those guys are solid. And I'll tell you what, Weber doing his best coaching job since his days at Southern Illinois.
All right, guys, you've set me up great for the segue into me making it official. All right, the key here for me, Bryan talked about it right in the last thing that he said. I'm looking at the two conferences. And to me, between the Big 12 and the SEC this year, it's head and shoulders. There's no comparison between it. The SEC has one dominant team. That was Florida. They controlled the conference all year. Think about this. Of the teams in the SEC, there's 14 teams. 9 of the 14 teams this year were 500 or below. 6 of the 9 were below 500. That's not a good conference. You had the one good team at the top, then you had Kentucky, and then you had maybe Georgia, and that's stretching it really even on the Georgia side. I look at this Kansas State team, and I think the Big 12, although they didn't have all the gaudy records, you got a lot of teams with 9, 10, 11 losses. It's because they beat each other up. They were a good conference, and I think that's made Kansas State tougher. And Ken touched upon it. They showed in the Iowa State game that they can play an up-tempo game. I don't think it's the right move. I think they want to slow it down and play this game in the 60s, which I think they're better at, and then they put Kentucky in a half-court game. If you look at some of the games Kentucky's played this year, especially down the stretch, this team doesn't shoot the ball that well. I don't want to be laying points in a first-round tournament game with a team that has trouble shooting. Look at some of these games late in the season. At home to Arkansas, they shot 34% from the floor. At South Carolina, which nobody is going to, argue that South Carolina is a defensive juggernaut. They only shot 27% in that game against South Carolina on the road, and then at home to Alabama, they only shot 32%. I'm not going to lay that kind of number with a team that is not efficient offensively. Now, if they're able to control the tempo and make this game play in the 80s, it's a different story, because then they don't have to shoot that high percentage because they're using their athleticism to go up and down the floor. They're going to get some transition points. But I think Kansas State can slow this game down. And if you want to say, hey, are you looking at a correlated parlay? Well, yeah, I would also be looking at the under in this game, because I think that's the key to Kansas State. And I think the Kansas State coach is smart enough to have his game plan to try to take some air out of the basketball and shorten this game. I'm going to take Kansas State. The line is sitting there now, but I'm going to tell you what. The big dance, this is the most heavily bet thing in sports next to the NFL. When you get to March Madness, you're going to have a lot of people in town that are going to be playing games that don't bet basketball all season long, and they're going to be betting the marquee teams. Wait until as close to post time as you can on this game, because you're going to get the best number, because the public will bet Kentucky. On their own, they're going to bet Kentucky, and if they keep listening to everybody else talking about Kentucky, that's going to bring more people to Kentucky, and we'll get a better line closer to game time. Take Kansas State plus the points. This one goes down to the wire. Don't be surprised, guys, if they win this one outright.
I'll tell you another thing as far as Kansas State. They crashed the boards collectively as a team. Randall's dominant, but sometimes he needs Cauley Stein to be out there with him to even things out on the glass. But Cauley Stein's a liability, only 49% from the free throw line, so Calipari has to get him out of there stretch time if Kentucky has a small lead. So, again, I agree with you. I think K-State's going to be right in that thing.
All right, we're going to be back next. Ken's got a free pick. We're going to take a look at Tulsa and the suddenly red-hot UCLA Bruins. That's up next, pregame.tv.